We Christians know that the true resurrected one is Yeshua, but the world doesn't know that. They will be deceived by the counterfeit resurrected one. So this is why you need to know that you have a relationship with the God of the universe through his son Yeshua. Otherwise, according to Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, God will send a strong delusion on those who refuse to accept the truth, and therefore Satan's lie will become part of their destruction eventually. They will believe this lie because they rejected the truth. And I believe this coincides with this resurrection of the Antichrist, this lie that Antichrist declares himself to be God. Christians wouldn't fall for that. In fact, we Christians know, this is a side rabbit, but it's worth sidetracking for a second. We Christians know for a fact that Jesus died once and then resurrected, and only should die once, right? Read your Bible. Know your Bible. Jesus, the true Messiah, died once and for all. His death was efficacious and needed to only happen once. He needn't die again. He will not die again. He lives forevermore. Read the book of Hebrews. Study it. Therefore, this resurrected one that I'm warning you away from, he cannot be the true Messiah because the true Messiah will not die again. And yet, the world doesn't know the Bible. They have rejected Jesus. Sadly, eschatological Jerusalem, Israel, Judaism, which goes into the 70th week, will also largely be in deception. At least those who have not been investigating the New Testament, they will be in deception. And therefore, they will embrace this Antichrist, and they will declare him as their Messiah, especially if he gives them the permission they need to rebuild their temple and start their sacrifices again. So when he dies and resurrects, they have this kind of sense of understanding that the Messiah is supposed to die, right? But if they don't know who the true Jesus is from the fake, then they're going to be deceived as well. And they're going to embrace the counterfeit resurrection. All right, thank you everyone for joining me for these live internet studies week after week. My name is Araban Lyman Hanavi. Just real quick, the studies are an hour and a half long. First study is an eschatology study, end time events. That's an hour long. The second study is a apologetic study on Trinity versus non-Trinitarian type topics. That one's 30 minutes long. So you're ready now for the first one. If you look on your screen, you'll see that we have been in topic 13, Mystery Babylon discussion part 1. We're still in that topic. We're talking about this topic of Mystery Babylon, and we're using Chris White's thesis, which is that Mystery Babylon is actually end time Jerusalem, eschatological Jerusalem to be sure. Not current Jerusalem so much. Today she doesn't really fit the description. But as we're working our way through the study, we're working through his verse-by-verse exposition of Revelation chapter 17 and chapter 18. And within that discussion, there have been a lot of questions about the identity of not just Mystery Babylon, but remember in Revelation chapter 17, when John sees the woman who's we're identifying as Mystery Babylon, she's riding a beast, a seven-headed, ten-horned beast. And when John is told by the angel who this woman is and who the beast is, the angel starts with the description of the beast. And so we've taken our time to begin to focus on the woman, but now I want to do something that I'm going to say represents an excursus because I'm not in my week sequence. We've already gone through week 1 and week 2 and week 3 even. We're technically ready to go to week 4, but let's call this an excursus for a moment. This excursus, which is kind of like a digression, is actually going to address the issue of the identity of the Antichrist, not so much by name, but by one of his chief characteristics, which is his supposed death and resurrection. And we're also going to tonight find out the effect that this death and resurrection are going to have on the entire world. And we're going to try and do this based on the scripture. But I am going to be reading from Chris White's book. The book is available online. Let me show you what it looks like when it's not in this form. The book is, give me a second. I'm going to make a second tab because I don't want to lose this one. All right. If I go back to his books online right now, you can see I'm at BibleProphecyText.com. And there, Chris White, who's a Christian, he's a pre-wrather such as myself, he makes his books available for free, and he openly and freely allows people to use them. So just real quick, if you scroll down through past the Daniel book, you see that Mystery Babylon is the next book in line. It's red cover with big words, Mystery Babylon, an exposition of Revelation 17 and 18. And within that book, you can see the, over on the right side, you can see the list of books. But within this particular book, which you can read online, that's when we get to chapter 2. So in my study, we're on week 3, but we're still in chapter 2. We just finished chapter 2, basically, in my study. But now I want to actually slow down a little bit and go into some of these details about the Antichrist. So let me scroll down to where I left off. Okay. So we're going to start basically in Revelation chapter 17, starting in verse 8. And again, what we're going to do tonight is, just like the thumbnail shows you, I want to show you that this resurrection is going to cause the entire world to wonder, to worship. And my warning to you is, don't worship the resurrected one. And you're thinking, but that sounds like Yeshua. Exactly. The resurrection of the Antichrist is a counterfeit. And it's a counterfeit resurrection that will cause the entire world to worship him. That's what he wants. He wants you to worship the resurrected one. But again, like my cryptic thumbnail shows, you don't see it now, but I mean, you saw it before you clicked on the video. Don't worship the resurrected one. You're like, what? What are you talking about, Ariel? Okay, let's read it tonight. Start in 17, verse 8, and we'll work our way down through this. Again, these are Chris White's notes, and we're just going to follow through them line by line. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. Chris White says, so the angel begins to talk to John about the seven-headed, ten-horned beast that it's mentioned in the previous verse. I don't want to go line by line. I think I'll just go like this. Let's also go back to the beginning of this particular vision in Revelation 17 so that we can see the full description John gives this seven-headed, ten-horned beast. Some of this I'm going to read through fairly quickly because he gets into some details that I don't need to get into. The primary thrust of tonight, I don't want you to lose it, is how do we make sense of the way the Bible describes the resurrection of this Antichrist figure, and does it give us a clue as to making our speculation whether or not this Antichrist man will be someone who's a resurrected person from the past? How far back can we say the past is? Is it a resurrection of one of the pharaohs? Is it a resurrection of Nebuchadnezzar? Is it a resurrection of maybe Nero? How about Antiochus Epiphanes? He's clearly a type and shadow of the Antichrist. Is it a resurrection of him? Or is it more likely that it's a resurrection of someone that at the time when the prophecy is going to be fulfilled, namely during the 70th week, is it a resurrection of a man who comes onto the scene as both a champion of Israel and of Christianity, but gets assassinated and then comes back to life within our own contemporary time frame so that we witness both the living person, the death, and we witness the resurrection. And that's what causes the world to worship. Could it be that? So let's work our way down through this. So we have a description of the scarlet-colored beast full of names in Revelation 17:3. Blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Chris White notes that there's some additional information that this 7-headed, 10-horned beast was also scarlet and full of names of blasphemy. And he also mentions, again, I'm going through some of this quickly because I'm not focusing on so much the how do we say, the fact that John's trying to make sure that we understand that this is the same beast that he mentioned earlier, all the way back in, say, chapter 12 and then chapter 13, and then now we're reading about him again in chapter 17, which, by the way, goes all the way back to Daniel chapter 7. But the point being is that Chris White says that this is the same description given to the beast 4 chapters earlier in Revelation chapter 13, which is about the Antichrist. So what Chris White is keying in on is that what John does in the book of Revelation is he starts by giving us a description of a beast that clearly evokes images taken from the book of Daniel, specifically chapter 7, with beasts that rise up out of a sea. And these beasts are indicative of kingdoms in Daniel, but by the time we read further down into Daniel, we start zeroing in on this little horn who rises up after 10 horns. And this little horn is also connected to the fourth beast, which itself is a kingdom, an empire. But when we get to the book of Revelation, even though the book of Revelation is reminding us about Daniel's beasts, empires, the book of Revelation starts to zero in on a specific man known as the beast, also known as the Antichrist. So the word beast in the book of Revelation plays like 3 different roles. It can be the beast empire itself, the larger concept, the larger beast kingdom. It can be the human being known as the Antichrist, but then it can also represent the satanic power that drives both of them, which is Satan himself. Thus, the word beast has that kind of 3 usages there. I'm not saying that the beast indicates 3 different people. In some cases it does. In some verses it shows that. So, right now, as we're in Daniel chapter 17, the woman is riding a beast. In the one sense, she's riding a system that's sitting on many waters, which is many peoples and nations and tongues. And so that represents some type of a worldwide system. But on the other hand, the woman being Mystery Babylon, the city, she is in collusion with a man. And a man has taken his seat in the temple of Jerusalem and declared himself to be God, at least by the midpoint of the week. And this man is not the entire system. This man is the Antichrist. So picking up where Chris White left off, the beast in that chapter, chapter 13, also has 7 heads, 10 horns, and has names of blasphemy. So this kind of links it back to the satanic kingdoms that have all been built up to this point over history of Satan trying to do his best to destroy God's people. Chris White says this is not coincidental, nor is it the only time in our verse, Revelation 17:8, that there is an explicit reference to Revelation 13 about the Antichrist beast. All right. Chris White goes on to say that, in fact, I intend to show that the angel gives almost no new information in this verse. The new information from the angel about this beast will come after this verse, but verse 8 here almost serves as a very long reintroduction to the Antichrist beast in Revelation 13, using titles and descriptions of him already clearly established. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to journey through parts of the book of Revelation. We're going to jump backwards to 13 at times. We're going to stay anchored in 17. We might even pull in parts of 12. And we might also pull in parts of Daniel chapter 7. But the primary thrust is I want you to notice that when we get to the parts that talk about the death and the resurrection of this figure, not so much the death and resurrection of an empire, although that theme is picked up as well, going all the way back to Daniel chapter 2, and then picked up again in Daniel chapter 7, where we've got these kingdoms that kind of show up, and then we can tell that they're going to show up again. Everyone's heard of the idea of a revived Roman Empire, right? That's what I mean by show up once and then show up again. But more germane to our point here in Revelation is that John is zeroing in on a human, a man who dies and then is resurrected. And we don't know if it's a genuine resurrection. We don't know if it's a faked resurrection. We don't know if it is some form of recreation by resequencing DNA or things. I mean, by science tech standards today, we can imagine all sorts of scenarios. I'm just going to go with the general sense of what John wrote about a death and a resurrection. And we're going to go with that. And how that'll play out later on, we're not certain. But at face value, I think we can ascertain that John saw in his visions a death and a resurrection. All right. So I'm going to skip past some of this part that Chris White talks about, how he's trying to identify some of the technical parts of that verse 8, and how he shows that John's not giving more new information. I want to skip past that because I'm working my way down to this cryptic phrase right here. Was and is not and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. So this is a cryptic phrase that shows up here in chapter 17, starting in verse 8. So let me do this real quick. I want to pull up my references and show you this. So Revelation, let me zoom in a bit. Chapter 17. So if we scroll down to verse 8, which is the verse that we have in question right now, we can see that John says, the beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who live on the earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. So notice there's kind of a bookending in the verse itself. The was and is not and will come is the first part of the verse of verse 8, and it's the last part of the verse 8. This appears to me to be some indication that it is relevant information, so much that John opens with it and he closes with it. It creates a kind of a bookending. All right, the beast. So notice that this beast that was previously identified in chapter 12 and then moving into chapter 13, this beast is described by John with this sort of title that allows us to understand which beast we're talking about. Indeed, when we get down to verse 11, sorry, I went past, sorry, let's go here. When we get down to verse 11, we have another similar description. The beast which was and is not and is himself also an eighth and is one of the seven, and he goes to destruction. We're going to need to be able to put together these labels of this particular beast, and that's what Chris White's going to do for us in his book. So let's go back. So we're starting with Revelation 17:8 with this first part, was and is not and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. Remember, knowing that he's going to mention the was and is not once more later on near the end of verse 8. Okay, so notice we've got 17:8, we've got the beast that thou saw, which was and is not and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. We have it right there. And then down to the very bottom, we have the same thing, similar, but slightly different wording. The beast that was and is not and yet is. So we can see, even in one verse, that the was matches in both spots, the is not matches in both spots, but the first one that says shall ascend out of the bottomless pit matches with and yet is. You can see that, yes? And also, when we get to verse 11, we have a similar match. We have the beast that was is a match with was in the verse 8. We have is not is a match with the is not in verse 8. But then now we have he is the eighth and is of the seventh and goeth into perdition. So the he is the eighth matches with and yet is, and also matches with and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. And then it's interesting that and shall go into perdition in verse 8 is reproduced again in verse 11 as and goeth into perdition. So at the very least, we can see that there's a relationship between verse 8 and verse 11. And that's kind of the thesis that we're working from. So keep those verses in mind. Now let's jump back into Chris White's commentary or his book here. So what he says is that this phrase gives people a great deal of difficulty, so we're going to spend a bit of time on it. And this is also what I'm doing for this video as the Excursus, because I received a lot of email about, hey, Ariel, who do you think the beast is? Who do you think the Antichrist is? You think he'll be someone that was born in the past and blah, blah, blah. And there are commentaries that also speculate on him being perhaps someone that was alive during John's day. right? Because he talks about the beast that was and is. He says and is. And they're like, doesn't that mean that he was someone that was alive during John's day? And they say, well, the verb tenses allow for it when it says was. I mean, was from John's day means prior to John writing, right? Isn't that what it means? Could it have been Nero? Could it have been Judas? Could it have been Antichrist? Because Antichrist came, not Antichrist, Antiochus came prior to John. Well, that's what we're going to deal with tonight. We're going to see, is there anything in John's revelation, in John's writing, the revelation of Yeshua, in the book of Revelation that can give us some clues as to when is this person expected to live and then die and then be resurrected? Is there any way we can ascertain that? All right, Chris White says this phrase gives people a great deal of difficulty, so we'll spend a bit of time on it. Chris White says, I intend to show that this idea of was and is not and coming out of the bottomless pit is a title referring to the Antichrist having been miraculously healed or resurrected from the dead. All right, and we're also going to find that there are more times when this title shows up, about 5 different times that John uses this something similar, and it'll help give us a clue as to what he is referring to. Let's continue. The last phrase in this verse, the beast that was and is not and yet is, being another way to say the same thing, that he lives, he dies, and he seems to rise again and will ultimately go to destruction or perdition. That's what I just mentioned. It's sort of a chronology of his entire career on earth, and it functions as a title on several occasions in the book of Revelation. Now, this is going to be interesting. If you notice all of these taken together, it will become apparent, as we're going to see these, that it's impossible for John really to be referring to someone that lived prior to his own time frame. All right. Chris White says, before I begin to explain the details of this, we need to refresh our memories to the significance that the Bible puts on the seeming resurrection of the Antichrist from the dead. And again, this is not a side issue for us as well. If the Bible emphasizes something, then we need to pay attention. And I believe, like Chris White's going to mention in his particular book here, that the fact that Antichrist rises from the dead, whether it's a fake resurrection or the genuine. Remember my last video that talked about warning. It was the thumbnail of I'll flash it from you in post-production. I think I'll flash it for you right now. Give me a second. I think I've got it. Danger, don't be amazed, right? This was the thumbnail for my previous video. And I've got this arrow pointing to the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 3, where it talks about that he's got this this Antichrist figure that rises from the dead or has this wound, and the whole world was amazed at this resurrection, whatever. So that's why I had this particular thumbnail. Maybe I'll make it full screen there so I can see. And I saw one of his heads that has been wounded, and it was his deadly wound was healed, and all the world followed and wondered and was amazed after the beast. I'm like, danger, danger! Don't be amazed at this particular sign. So let's go back over, and that's why I'm kind of continuing on this theme. The Bible puts a lot of information or significance to this particular seeming resurrection or genuine resurrection, and so we need to focus on it as well. So what I decided to do is just to make sure we understand this idea. Let's review Revelation 13, which is primarily about the Antichrist, to make sure we understand this preliminary idea. In the relatively short chapter of Revelation 13, it mentions the Antichrist's fatal wound that was healed 3 times. It mentions this 3 times. And the first instance is in verse 3, where I showed you just a moment ago. This was part of my thumbnail from previous week. Quote, and I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. That's why I said in my little warning, don't be amazed. Don't wonder after this beast. Warning, danger. And in my current thumbnail, okay, which is, you need to be careful about which resurrection you're giving your allegiance to. The verse continues, and they worshipped the dragon. Who is the dragon? Well, in chapter 12, we're given the identity. We don't have to guess. In Revelation chapter 12, the dragon is Satan. So they worship the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worship the beast. And these are the earth dwellers, right? The people on earth whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the unbelievers of the world at the time. And they worship the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? So that's Revelation 13, 3 and 4. So there's coming a time when a man will live, be assassinated. At least we believe it's an assassination. I don't believe it's going to be a natural death, because he says he has a wound by the sword. So that sounds like an assassination to me. And it maybe even hints at who does the assassinating based on the type of death, right? A sword? Okay, we'll think about that in a moment. But the individual in question resurrects. And in our modern lifetime, we haven't seen such a resurrection as this. And this individual will then take his seat in the temple, declare himself to be God. So I think the assassination and resurrection will take place just prior to the midpoint of the week, somewhere around there. I can't be dogmatic, but that seems to line up. So Chris White continues, here it seems to imply that the world's worship of the beast is directly connected to his deadly wound being healed. It says that they wondered after him, saying, who can make war with him? This is the exact same word used in our current verse, wondered. It's also in the exact same context, i.e. wondered from the earth dwellers associated with worship and the Antichrist's apparent resurrection from the dead. So just getting the context, this worship from the world is in connection with the resurrection of this man from the dead. Very scary. So this is one of the first descriptions of the Antichrist that is given in the book of Revelation 13. It's right after the symbolic imagery of verses 1 and 2. This is the first thing that we're told about the beast. Remember, at this point in time, the book of Revelation has used this word beast to refer to Satan as a beast that rises out of the sea in chapter 12. But then it also describes a beast who is his second in command, the false prophet. But eventually, by the time we get to chapter 13 and chapter 17, the beast is both this system, a kingdom, but more focused, a man, an individual, a person, right? The Antichrist himself. So this beast that we read about here in Revelation 13, he has a deadly wound that is healed. And it's one of the first things that we read about. The Bible, as we will see, considers this event very important. And then it says, by the second reference to this the event in verse 12, the idea of a healed deadly wound has become a title or an identifying description of the beast. Here it distinguishes the first beast from the second by adding the clarification whose deadly wound was healed. And again, that's part of why we need to also begin to recognize that this title that we're talking about, whose deadly wound was healed, or the fact that he's the resurrected one, is a title that the Bible is emphasizing for a very important reason. And I don't want you to miss that reason. It's in my thumbnail again. Warning, be very afraid of the resurrected one. Now I'm being cryptic for a reason, because we Christians know that the true resurrected one is Yeshua. But the world doesn't know that. They will be deceived by the counterfeit resurrected one. So this is why you need to know that you have a relationship with the God of the universe through his son Yeshua. Otherwise, according to Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, God will send a strong delusion on those who refuse to accept the truth, and therefore Satan's lie will become part of their destruction eventually. They will believe this lie because they rejected the truth. And I believe this coincides with this resurrection of the Antichrist, this lie that Antichrist declares himself to be God. Christians wouldn't fall for that. In fact, we Christians know, this is a side rabbit, but it's worth sidetracking for a second. We Christians know for a fact that Jesus died once and then resurrected, and only should die once, right? Read your Bible. Know your Bible. Jesus, the true Messiah, died once and for all. His death was efficacious and needed to only happen once. He needn't die again. He will not die again. He lives forevermore. Read the book of Hebrews. Study it. Therefore, this resurrected one that I'm warning you away from, he cannot be the true Messiah, because the true Messiah will not die again. And yet, the world doesn't know the Bible. They have rejected Jesus. Sadly, eschatological Jerusalem, Israel, Judaism, which goes into the 70th week, will also largely be in deception. At least those who have not been investigating the New Testament, they will be in deception. And therefore, they will embrace this Antichrist, and they will declare him as their Messiah, especially if he gives them the permission they need to rebuild their temple and start their sacrifices again. So when he dies and resurrects, they have this kind of sense of understanding that the Messiah is supposed to die, right? But if they don't know who the true Jesus is from the fake, then they're going to be deceived as well. And they're going to embrace the counterfeit resurrection. So let's keep going. We have this verse in verse 12 that, again, just lets us know that there are many beasts within the scene. There's the Antichrist himself. There's a false prophet who's also called a beast. But only one of them is given this title. And he, the false prophet, exerciseth all the power of the first beast, the Antichrist, before him, and causes the earth and them which dwell therein to do what? To worship the first beast, which is the false prophet, which is the Antichrist, The first beast is the Antichrist. And look at the label that John gives it in the book of Revelation again, Revelation 13:12, whose deadly wound was healed. So notice again, there's a few things that are being highlighted by John. We're highlighting this Antichrist figure who dies and is resurrected. That's being highlighted, his death and resurrection. But it's also highlighting this connection between the earth dwellers and the worship they give to him based on the fact that he resurrects. All right, and then we see the third reference in 13. We see that the healed deadly wound is used again as a title or distinguishing characteristic of the Antichrist beast. Here we have again Revelation 13:14, and the false prophet deceiveth them that dwelleth on the earth by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, again, technical title for those who do not believe in Jesus, those who do not have the mark of God in their foreheads, those who do not embrace Yeshua. So unbelievers, those that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. And it's remarkable here that we get the type of death because it says a wound by a sword. Now, this is a side note I'm not going to go into right now. We will in a different day though, but what type of system inflicts wounds by a sword by today's standards? Most modern armies shoot people with guns or missiles or drones or things like that. Not too many people running around wielding swords against their enemies. But there is a people group and a religion that still worships or elevates swords quite prominently in even in their executions. And I'll let you guys fill in the blank. Put it in the comments if you know who I'm referring to. Tell me in the comments who you think might be the type of group or even a religious organization, I'm practically giving it away to you, that might use a sword against their enemies, against those who don't follow after their particular brand of ideology. Who might wield a sword? And when we say sword here, I know it could be symbolic, but what if it's literal? What if it really is a sword? Also, remember in the book of Revelation, the martyrs are beheaded for their faith, right? Sword, head wound, beheaded. Okay, you guys fill it in. Tell me in the comments who you think I'm referring to. All right, back to Chris White's book here. So we're reading from the book entitled Babylon, when eschatological Jerusalem embraces the Antichrist. It's kind of an exposition of Revelation chapter 17 and chapter 18. We're about 30 minutes into my study right now, and unless I say otherwise, this might be a great place to call it part A in the video and pick this thing up again with part B, okay? Stay tuned.